Hello, I'm Isaac Kardon, and this is the World Unpacked. Today, I'm joined by two esteemed colleagues. We have the SK Korea Foundation Chair and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, Dr. Andrew Yeo, with us today. And we are also joined by my colleague here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Asia Program, Dr. Ashley Tellis, who's the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs. Today, we're going to be focusing on some of the insights generated from a book project that Andrew and I put together over the course of the last several years and that was recently released by Raman and Littlefield. It's called Great Power Competition and Overseas Basing, Chinese, Russian, and American Force Posture in the 21st Century. And a link to the book is in the show notes. So we've been working on this over the course of the last several years, and this has been a pretty fluid and dynamic field with a lot of growth and some retrenchment. And we've been wrestling with the question of how to understand the dynamics between the U.S. military and its vast overseas basing system that Andrew and others have studied for decades. And for me, focusing on China's growing global military presence and efforts to establish bases and places around the world. And this inevitably led us to a couple questions, but maybe, Andrew, you could start us off and tell us a little bit about what brought us here. So what are the major questions that inspired you to initiate this project?
Sure. Well, first, let me just say it's a pleasure to come over to our next-door neighbor from Brookings and just to get the ball rolling in terms of how we thought about this project. Well, actually, when I first started doing research on bases 2 decades ago, when you said that you wanted to study overseas basing, it was really just about United States bases. There's no other country in the world that has the force posture, the global reach that the U.S. has, and really we're the only country in the world that can project power globally. But in the last couple of decades, a couple of changes have happened which I felt warranted a comparative study on great power basing. And the first is this bigger concern about the growth of the People's Liberation Army and recognition that China will want to protect its investments, ensure its own freedom of navigation and commerce. And that's where I think you stepped in, and which I'll get back to. But then the second thing, of course, is the return of great power competition. If you remember, in the first Trump administration, the national security strategy that came out in 2017, they talked about great power competition, China and Russia. And so around that time frame, I remember you were here in Washington, D.C., Isaac, for a conference hosted by National Bureau of Asian Research, NBR. This is 2019, and we had this conversation in part because there was this concern about Chinese ports and that they might be dual use, and we had this conversation about bases with other academics who look at this topic, who look at Russia. We had these broader conversations, and that's how this project was launched. But in terms of the framing for the book, we went through this quite a bit. It was all through the pandemic, actually, and if you say we want to study global basing comparatively, it's a huge topic. It's too difficult to study all bases everywhere all at once. And so we decided that it would make more sense to break down and look at things in a more manageable way. And that's where I think interactions across different regions seemed more productive. That some great powers will matter more over others in different regions. There's different dynamics at play. So for instance, if we think about variation and interactive effects of regions, and in the Indo-Pacific, I think how basing plays out in East Asia versus the South Pacific or the Indian Ocean region will look different. In Europe, China's not really a factor there, but it's really about perhaps Russia and the United States. In Africa, the U.S. has less of a footprint or presence, but I think China and Russia has some interests there as well, too. So I think this regional dynamic, looking at great power competition within different regions, as we discussed this, we thought that would make sense. Just 2 other quick points of some of the broad takeaways is, and this is really coming from your research, Isaac, on China and ports, is the economic logic of basing. That's something that I don't think has been studied all that much, but it just reminded me of 19th century U.S., these debates about imperialism in 19th century United States and this argument that where there's commerce, the flag will follow. are we seeing that pattern again with China? So that was another theme, I think, that emerged. And then lastly, this question of prioritization, which I think the three of us will probably have a longer discussion on. But as we look at different regions, where should the U.S. in particular prioritize its force posture, its military presence? And I think those are ongoing debates we're having even right now during the second Trump administration.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrew. And fortunately, we have here some adult supervision from the brilliant Ashley Tellis, who has been subjected to this great volume, which I should mention was published by Rowman and Littlefield at the end of last year and is available at all major booksellers online and in real life. But let me turn it over to you, Ashley, for some reactions, comments, questions, and let's dive into this discussion.
Well, thank you, Isaac and Andrew. And let me start by actually congratulating the both of you and your collaborators in actually bringing this book to fruition. It's been a long time since I've actually seen a systematic study of the issues pertaining to overseas basing. There have been obviously many studies done about the United States over the years, but to be able to pull together a comparative study, and not just a comparative study involving the United States, China, and Russia, but also how these three countries interact in different regions of the world, I think is really a remarkable achievement. So certainly for our listeners, I want to commend the book, for your examination, reflection, and so on and so forth. Let me say a few things about the book itself, because I think that would help us, launch into the conversation. The issue of bases, to my mind, are interesting because they are really persistent symbols of political interests, strategic commitments, and warfighting capabilities, right? All three dimensions, in a sense, come together when you look at the whole issue of basing. So when one looks at the national strategies of these countries, United States, China, and Russia, you are immediately drawn through three different dimensions and how bases fit in the context of those dimensions. The first is, what is the grand strategy of the country involved? How does it see itself and its role in the world? How does it relate to the world, particularly when it comes to instruments of force? So that's one set of issues. The second is, what are the country's geopolitical obligations, either formal or informal commitments? And how do those commitments translate into issues of military presence? And of course, in its most tangible form, in physical presence, which is what the bases are all about. And then last, of course, military effectiveness. When one thinks about bases, we think of them in terms of what they bring to the international environment beyond just symbology. They're actually a tangible set of capabilities, even though they are in some sense simply receptacles for other capabilities, right? But not having those receptacles can actually limit your ability to use the other instruments of power. And what I think has been done wonderfully in this book is that it has examined the interests of all the three powers that you've looked at each of these three levels. How does grand strategy shape the incentives of the three powers to think about basing? What forms that interest in basing may take, depending on the grand strategies in question? How political commitments, either to territory, to regions, to allies, or the absence thereof, shapes the incentives of countries to acquire, preserve, maintain bases. And then, of course, the third, what is the impact on military effectiveness? Does it help or hinder in certain cases? And the hindrances are just as important when one thinks about, for example, the Indo-Pacific and the vulnerability of bases and so on and so forth. Three things leapt out at me when I read the chapters. The first thing that leaps out of the book when one looks at the comparative chapters is that the United States is truly in a class by itself. It's a genuinely hegemonic power. It's not just simply the most powerful country in the world, which of course it is, but it's hegemonic in that it seeks to use its power to uphold a certain conception of order that serves its interests. And the inheritance that the United States has with respect to bases really derives from that hegemonic vision, right? There are many powerful countries. Not all of them pursue bases. But the United States does because it sees bases as integral elements of that larger conception of order. Now, the interesting question that comes out, and you begin to explore this in the book, is the issue of China. As China becomes more powerful, will it translate power into a vision of hegemony that then requires it to maintain capabilities comparable to that of the United States? I mean, that's a really interesting question as one looks out at it, and I want to have you respond to what you think the storyline there is. The second is that the United States alone has a very unique basing structure, right, which is large pieces of real estate which are supposed to underwrite the geopolitical commitments and power projection. The Chinese appear to have gone in somewhat different directions. They recognize that they need physical access, and so they've sort of tried to invest in civil military facilities. But we've not seen anything, if excepting, say, Djibouti, that compares with the classic notion that we have of bases. And so the interesting question that I would like you all to speak to when we begin this conversation is this simply a problem of transition? Or is this likely to morph into something very different? The third insight that I took from reading the book was that military technology is right now experiencing dramatic transformations. And yet, even though we have the capability to bring enormous lethality to bear at very long distances, no one has yet managed to resolve the challenges posed by the gradient of distance. So you can have all kinds of fancy military technology, but distance imposes costs, it degrades effectiveness, and it has an impact on the ability to apply persistent power. And that's where bases make such a difference. That if you don't have the bases, you may have reach, but it's not persistent reach. And so the fact that even in the face of great technological transformations, we need very old-fashioned things, like the old coaling stations of the 19th century, is really something that leaps out of the pages of the book, right? And then once you appreciate this, then so many of the other sub-stories in the book become very vivid. You know, why are the Chinese making dramatic efforts to acquire access in places like Africa, in Oceania? Russia still, despite its fall from power and grace, holding on to that piece of real estate in Syria. Are we likely to see greater Russian interests, say, for example, in the Mediterranean in time to come, and so on and so forth? So there is a wealth of insight that this book is brimming with. And I want to engage you in a conversation to sort of tease out some of these aspects that I just flagged out. So why don't we start where I just left off, which is to ask both of you the question. Even though we are in a rapidly changing world, are there some enduring constants in a competitive international environment where military force still has a quality of primacy, right? And are bases part of those constants as we think about the evolution of the international system? So when you guys put this book together, what was your answer to this question?
Sure. I mean, that question, first, that was a terrific layout of kind of teasing out, pulling out some of these themes in the book that we can discuss. I like this argument about the tyranny of distance and whether technology, because there's this argument that technology has made bases obsolete at this point. I mean, there was a piece by Stephen Rosen that you shared in Foreign Affairs last month that said that we should just cluster bases in the Western Hemisphere and up in space, that's what matters. But I mean, I would strongly disagree with that assessment just because the tyranny of distance and the physicality of fighting a war requires having logistics. It requires having a place to refuel. Going back to the coaling stations of the 19th century, but we still need to refuel. We still need to be closer to the action, and for those reasons, I think bases will still be relevant. Now, I know there's questions about what it means in terms of force posture. So because the way we fight wars, too, with precision weapons, with long-range, with bombers, with long-range missiles, I mean, that makes, the arguments that will make bases a liability, that it's a sitting duck. You concentrate your forces in one place, and they can be wiped out by a long-range missile. So the answer is yes, I think bases are still going to be important, but the question is how do we need to disperse bases? How should we think about rearranging force posture in a way that can adapt to some of these new technologies that have emerged and also minimize some of these liabilities? So I don't think bases are going to go away anytime soon, but how we reconfigure force posture, I think that's what may change.
Absolutely. And I think we would need to see truly dramatic innovations in technology, right? So when Steve talks about operating from space, it's a great idea. But you have to defeat orbital mechanics to be able to stay in a particular location for a long period of time in order to be able to bring firepower to bear from a certain space location to a certain terrestrial target. And maybe we will get to the Star Wars, the movie Star Wars, where, you can have space cruisers sort of lurking, over terrestrial locations, but we're not there yet. And so until we get there, the point that geography is going to matter, bases are going to matter is a point well taken. Isaac.
Yeah, well, just to continue this discussion, I would maybe offer a historical gloss on it, which is that the current incarnation, say, of overseas basing, and it's worth thinking of it as an incarnation. We've had many hegemonic powers with different types of basing and access arrangements, is really a product of the last great power war. That's sort of the very macro high level dynamic to my mind, and it's inconceivable that the United States would have the position it has in Asia or Europe in the absence of that Second World War, and then in the absence of the Cold War that followed, that sort of created an enduring necessity, at least not to withdraw and open the gates to the Soviets, rightly or wrongly. This is the theory that informed it. And, looking back now, I don't think there's a single person in the defense planning space who'd say, this is the way we would lay down our force posture now. We would do it exactly like this, and we wouldn't adjust it. So there's obviously, whether it's technological or strategic or political factors that inform that, these are very sticky institutions. And Andrew, you'll know this far better about the ways that, the domestic host nations have both been allergic to, but also embraced these, and they've been a part of their security structure. And it's impossible to sort of postulate what East Asia would look like had it not been for the presence of the United States as the sort of security guarantor in the region, as the hegemonic power pursuing a grand strategy that dictated keeping major security threats contained in their regions as opposed to crossing the oceans to the United States. And as Ashley rightly points out, that's a particular grand strategic vision, and it's not one that is widely shared. It's something that is only a function, I would argue, of the U.S. Position after the Second World War, and there's nothing inevitable about it, and there's certainly nothing inevitable about China mirror imaging that. So maybe I'll transition a little bit and address your really interesting questions about whether we're seeing, as China sort of gradually establishes a much more robust position out of area, as you call it, but beyond East Asia, are we expecting that to start to resemble something familiar from the 20th century in the way the United States has done that, or something different? You never say never, so it's certainly conceivable that you'd start to see a much greater proliferation of Chinese basing posture, but I suspect that we're going to see much more of a gradual creeping expansion of their capability. And capability to do what? This is a really important question. You're talking about what's the nature of base's contribution to your military effectiveness. From where we sit today in April 2025, it's inconceivable to me that China is going to want to fight a war in a foreign theater. The idea of projecting high-end combat power into the Middle East, into Africa, into the Western Hemisphere, it's quite far-fetched. Unless and until their immediate periphery is secure, where it's worth noting Taiwan is sort of the centerpiece of their strategic thinking and has been for 70-plus years. They have territorial disputes with India, also in their region, as well as a couple minor territorial disputes in the South China Sea, but that nonetheless are part of the enduring justification for the United States' presence there. Unless and until those are resolved, I don't think there's the strategic scope for China to entertain the idea that it's going to try and extend itself in the way that the U.S. sort of has found itself at this moment. Again, never say never. Something about just having the capability to reach out and touch someone tends to incentivize that in some ways. And you certainly hear in Chinese discourse now this kind of media zeitgeist about, China's big and strong now. We have all these what they'll call overseas interests. And here they're thinking not just about citizens overseas, of which there are millions, and firms and enterprises and investments and assets, but most particularly in the area that I've focused on most with respect to sort of maritime transportation, this idea that their whole economic system depends on flows of goods around the world. So thinking about their relationship to U.S. hegemony, it's fair to say that they've taken a very close look at this and decided that free riding is the optimal strategy on a system that's relatively open, relatively stable, relatively secure. That assessment's in jeopardy, and it's not just this year. This has been a gradual process. And I think there's a lot to unpack there, but why don't we take a quick break now, and we will turn back to that question after our word from our sponsors.
Thanks for listening to the World Unpacked from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you enjoy the show, make sure to check out other audio series and podcasts from Carnegie. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show.
Let me just jump in right here and pick up where you left off on about China and their expansion, let's just say in the Indian Ocean region. I mean, the question for me goes back to Ashley's point about whether we're in a moment of transition. If we were to think back even just 30 years ago, would we imagine that China would have this massive system of ports around? Now that they have these ports, and now that several of these are dual use, what's it going to look like 30 years down the road? And so is this a transition point, especially if the U.S. decides to retrench or scale back? You mentioned that China has been free riding in some ways on the U.S. Protection of the high seas. So the freedom of navigation comes, I guess with the U.S. So the U.S. Navy has been ensuring freedom of navigation, but let's say the U.S. doesn't feel like doing that anymore. Will China step in? Will it have to also ramp up its own, the PLAN, its own naval forces to ensure that it has a free flow of commerce? If it does that, does it mean that it has to further militarize ports or set up bases? And so that's where I wonder if we are at an inflection point or not. Now, if I think about it right now, does China want to set up a base in sub-Saharan Africa or somewhere in the Indian Ocean? Probably not, because I don't think they have any intention to invade these countries or acquire territory. But if they feel threatened at some point, if they feel like access to these markets are threatened, or if they think that the U.S. is going to intervene, then maybe they want to protect their markets, protect their assets, and that's where you can begin thinking about militarization. So I guess I don't know if we're I feel like we are in a transition point. I don't know for sure. A lot of it depends on China's intentions. It also depends on whether the U.S. retrenches or whether the U.S. decides to sustain its own global force posture as well. But these are really, I think, important questions.
Let me come at this from a different point of view. I take seriously the argument that Isaac made, which is that the Chinese have their hands full protecting their own maritime periphery. And until they are confident that they've managed to resolve those problems, it's unlikely that they would look further afield with respect to maintaining a presence. But what if the operational imperatives drive them to think about going far before they solve the problems of the near? In fact, one could imagine them compelled to maintain some kind of presence farther away in order to shape the battle that is going to occur along their own frontiers. So, for example, if they could maintain a serious presence in the northern Indian Ocean, they would be able to constrain the flow of movements of U.S. forces from, say, the Gulf to Taiwan. They're already in the South China Sea for presumably that reason, because they want to choke off any U.S. movements through the straits to the Gulf. Their investments in Oceania, which initially I found curious, but then I, on reflection, realized that it's really taking a page out of the playbook of Imperial Japan, which is if you have a major presence in Oceania, you can interdict the westward flow of forces. So in some sense, you're right in that if everything moved smoothly, you control your periphery before you control your near abroad, and you control your near abroad before you control the vast overseas sort of expanses, right? But maybe you have to think about that in a reverse direction for purely operational reasons. I mean, is that a plausible?
Yeah, it's certainly plausible, and I think it would be to their great benefit if leadership in Beijing could have hear dissenting critical voices like that and think about their strategy in radically different terms. That said, I imagine that's something that has been on the table in some ways. But to my mind, what they've done thus far, particularly through the instrument of dual-use commercial military ports, is introduce certain capabilities, not these high-end warfighting capabilities, but certain capabilities that perhaps can't sink the U.S. Navy fleet in the Western Hemisphere or necessarily bottle them up in the Indian Ocean, but rather delay, degrade, complicate, create some potential for some type of minor horizontal escalation, because the primary strategic theater is the Western Pacific, and will continue to be. I suppose you could imagine China under a different party and different leadership that had a different sense of this. But I think this Chinese Communist Party, whether it's Xi Jinping or not, from a grand strategic standpoint, has to cross through that threshold before it entertains any other major grand strategic goals. So thinking about that question of what's the utility of these various places rather than bases. There is, of course, the one sole formal recognized base there in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. And there's, I think what everybody can agree at this point is basically a Chinese base at Reem. The Cambodians say it's not, and the Chinese say it's not, but the Chinese frigates and destroyers parked there, and the Chinese construction firm that built it, I think, tell us otherwise. But those are a bit of a red herring when you look at the overall strategic picture. There's been a huge discussion going on recently that's actually reviving an old discussion from the late 90s about China's presence at the Panama Canal. Now, that's a perfect example of exactly the strategy that I think is in effect now, which is the United States relies on that choke point, that canal, to flow its forces from the East Coast to the West Coast, or vice versa. But when we're thinking about these Pacific contingencies, of course, you're thinking about how is the U.S. going to bring the full force of its military capability to bear in that theater. And this is, as a sort of footnote, this is one of the reasons that comparing the size of the U.S. military forces to the size of the Chinese military forces isn't really the right comparison. It's a regional level analysis. China is in its home theater, and it gets to use all of its land-based missile forces to just start the conversation on all the things that they get to do. They don't need basing because they have their home basing and their interior lines. But in almost any contingency we envision in the Western Pacific, time is of the essence. And what you can do by, say, blocking up the Panama Canal, which I should say doesn't require the ownership or operation of any port. It just requires the will to stop a ship in the lock. We saw this perfectly illustrated in the Suez Canal during the Ever Given crisis in 2021. And I assure you, the Chinese naval strategists took note of what kinds of instruments can create this kind of a stoppage. This isn't a mission kill. They're not going to use whatever very limited capability they have there to prevent any of the fleet from the Atlantic getting into the Pacific theater. But if they have to go the long way and it takes a couple more weeks, that may be sufficient. That's a strategic effect. And if you think about scaling that up, and you also think about maybe less crude uses of your position at a port, consider just how much market share China has up and down all of the major maritime industries for transportation and logistics. This is one illustration of many of just how deeply embedded in all these supply chains they are. But you could imagine that China could hinder or delay or reroute or basically make it almost impossible for the United States to support its own logistics. As you're saying, there's a tyranny of distance, and this is particularly acute for the United States operating the Pacific theater, even with all of its basing laydown and even with its stepping stones across the Pacific. This is amateurs talk about strategy and professionals talk about logistics. This is the only conversation that's being had in a serious way in United States defense policy circles about what the nature of this conflict would be and what are our real limitations in that regard. And China's gone to school on this. They've watched the way the United States operates. They've seen the value of our bases, but they also see the liabilities that they introduce. You alluded to this early on, but the large forward presence that the United States has in East Asia, in particular in places like Japan and the Philippines and South Korea and even Guam now, are in range of this extraordinary array of Chinese missile capabilities. It is very difficult to envision any scenario in which you get more than one sortie from those airfields or which you're able to go back to those ports. China has already these are priorities on the target list, and those bases don't necessarily look like such great strategic assets. They're all in the WEZ, as they say, in the weapons engagement zone, and it's going to inevitably is causing a major rethink in the way the U.S. does this. So back to the original question of could China be looking to do something quite different and establish a much more robust posture overseas. Again, you can't rule it out, but I think that would be a major change of course from what we've seen. And I would view all of this development in sort of the commercial space and in the maritime transportation space as being aimed precisely at not having to rely on the United States to provide the openness of the system, not relying on the kindness of strangers as we now do in the United States to basically ship and produce our goods and get them to our consumers, but rather having their own organic capability and being able to use that to disrupt and delay, if not entirely deny, U.S. military capability.
It's like Amazon having your own logistics and delivery system all to yourself.
Very vertically
not relying on anyone
integrated,
else.
for sure.
So this discussion is fascinating on two counts. So let me start with the sort of narrow operational question that leaps out. Bases, particularly those close into China, are going to be vulnerable. And yet we can't quite do without them because the alternatives to those bases, which are other kinds of bases, aka floating bases called aircraft carriers or submarines, have lower capacities with respect to delivery of ordnance and so on and so forth. So does this mean that even as we think about basing, we need to be thinking more seriously about force posture, how you distribute assets across bases, what kind of redundancy you have between primary bases and alternate bases, and what your operating routines are. So no country is going to sort of say, oh, the base is vulnerable, therefore let's get out of the international politics business, right? You say the base is vulnerable, we need to figure out how we mitigate vulnerability, how we defeat the threat in spite of that vulnerability. What has the research shown you on this count? I mean, because it seems to me that the more bases become vulnerable, the more the United States is going to focus on essentially force distribution, force generation in more clever ways, and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, holding at risk the very weapons that threaten to make the base vulnerable, right? What do you see as the future of this offense-defense interaction over the next few years?
Yeah, so I'd mentioned that the U.S. maybe, so if we think about East Asia, the region that I know best, I mean, I've argued in my chapter with Michael Hanlon that I think we're roughly right size in terms of numbers, but the question of dispersal does come up. I think if you had your way, you would try to actually shift some of your force posture further west towards the Indian Ocean into Southeast Asia. The problem is there's no country, I think, in the 21st century that wants to have a large U.S. base. And so I think the future of basing will, it can't rely on these large, a large footprint. These are just relics of World War II. So you'll have to do more with less, but this often means basing access. So we'll have to find more strategic partners who will allow us access to their bases. I think that's something we're going to see more of that trend happening. In terms of protecting your existing force posture, I mean, I was looking through a transcript. It was earlier this month. The Indo-Pacific Command theater commander, Admiral Paparo, I think he was talking about needing to beef up theater missile defense within the region because of these concerns about being targeted by China. So that's something that you might do that could be useful, and then until you transition or figure out how you can further disperse your forces.
Yeah, I might jump in there because I realized I left the Western Indian Ocean question dangling, and it's interesting that those missile defenses have actually been moved towards the Western Indian
Don't
Ocean.
tell anyone about that.
Out of East Asia. Yeah, unfortunately, the cat is out of the bag on that, and I think this sort of raises the question of, while Ashley, you, of course, offer a sound prescription of what you would do to maintain a stable balance of power in the region while mitigating against the vulnerabilities of these large fixed bases like Yokosuka being sort of like the hub for naval 7th Fleet naval activity out there. It's also that's a big liability, and distributed lethality was the going Navy term for it some time ago. There's also these other countervailing forces, right? There's a bit of strategic ADD perhaps in going back to the Middle East to engage in some sort of coercion of Iran using some of these assets, not just THAAD and Patriot batteries, but aircraft carriers and all these still relatively scarce assets. So it's not necessarily the case that we're going to recognize our posture as right size. That also generates at a domestic political level the sense of, what are all these American service members doing out there within range of Chinese missiles? Is it really credible to China? That'd be a strategic question. Is it credible to China that the U.S. would put them at risk for these stakes? Is it worth the candle for the U.S.? And you certainly hear a lot of people suggesting that no, absolutely it doesn't, and we should be backing away from the door. From an analytical, historical standpoint, I'll just sort of assert as axiomatic that you don't want to make any sudden movements. Whatever you do, the idea of precipitously abandoning our allies and our basing posture invites a whole range of very destabilizing dynamics, whether it's China, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Russia, who we've given short shrift to, and maybe we'll return in our closing points. But I do think that the basic kind of tactical questions of how do bases work in the context of a contemporary great power competition, we don't have a good answer to that. We have theories about it. We now have this very tragic case study in the Ukraine of what some of these modern weapon systems look like in practice. But, particularly if you're thinking about East Asia or the Indian Ocean, you're talking about maritime theaters. You're talking about entirely different sets of assets, different actors, of course. And I think there really is no way. There is no way to know. You'll always be fighting the last war. This is sort of the well-known chestnut, but yeah, I don't know where that leaves us. Maybe we'll turn back to Ashley to help us sort this out. What do you expect to be happening now, given how much flux there is in our strategic outlook here in Washington?
Well, I think part of the question is going to be whether the president actually means what he says, right? The idea of having a disciplined grand strategy is one of those mythologies which has a long life. Every administration swears by it when they come into office. And as Harold Macmillan once said, what you fear most are events, because events force you to deviate, from the grand strategy. I lived, in the younger Bush administration. When President Bush came into office, the expectation was that we were going to be involved in a new round of great power competition, and the United States had to prepare for it. And China was the challenge over the horizon. And then you had the event of 9/11, and it took us for 2 decades in a radically different direction. The point you made, Isaac, about THAAD batteries leaving their original locations to end up in the Middle East, which was supposed to be the theater that we were exiting from, or at least sort of de-emphasizing, right, just proves the same point. So my own prejudiced view is that if the United States wants to preserve a global system that serves its interest, of course it's going to have to prioritize. But that prioritization cannot be mechanistic. You're obviously drawn to the theaters that you have the biggest stakes in. But you simply cannot write off other parts of the world by fiat, as Dean Acheson tried to do before the Korean War, or at least didn't intend to do, but had the effect of doing that, right? So in some sense, we will respond to challenges. And although the Middle East may not be important for us, it does matter to our allies, whether it's Israel or Europe or other countries in the world, right? And so we will end up having to protect some of these equities unless President Trump is really serious about taking the United States back to its continental base. Now, if that happens, that would be a transformation that takes us back to a previous era in U.S. history, right? But there are burdens of path dependency. There are burdens simply of the world that you have created and the obligations you have to that world, which are hard to simply walk away from. So this is really an open question. And I would not be surprised if 4 years out into this administration, we end up really somewhere where most administrations have been in the post-war period, right? Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me sort of ask you one question before we fold this. The book looks obviously at the United States, China, and Russia. But there have been important sort of explorations, not as individual chapters, but within chapters, about other countries, particularly the UK and France, which have, substantial overseas presence. What lessons did you take away from the experiences of intermediate powers? And over time, you can also throw in other countries like India, for example, which has interests in a wider Indian Ocean and so on and so forth. What role do you see the basis of these intermediate powers playing in the global great power competition that we've talked about?
I'll offer a thought, and I'm glad that we haven't neglected all the other actors who continue to have bases in France and Britain, are second and third, I believe, on the list, and that's sort of a residual from their former empires. But there obviously is not the level of capability nor a grand strategy that dictates that they should be using these facilities for, again, high-end power projection in foreign countries. They're more like legacies that they are reluctant to give up. And essentially, as part of the American-led security order, in the case of, in particular, of Britain, certainly less so France, you can think about facilities like Diego Garcia in Mauritius as it was under controversy British Indian Ocean territory that they nonetheless allow U.S. forces to operate from, and that's part of this de-pivot from Asia that we're seeing now too. We see a lot of bombers going back to Diego Garcia, and that's sort of the logistics hub for swinging in between theaters across the Indo-Pacific. And so I think of them as, at least to date, as playing an enabling role. But Britain's a more interesting example from the contemporary standpoint, because there really was a kind of handoff between the British and the Americans, and it wasn't really even during World War II. It wasn't until somewhat later. British sort of pretensions to empire lived a lot longer than the effective empire itself. And I think where that really happened is in the Middle East. And this is taking back to the point, is there conditions under which China would also enter the Middle East? And this is in the context of the Suez Crisis in 1956, and then President Eisenhower in the United States elected not to support this joint British-Israeli operation to seize the Suez Canal that had been nationalized by the Egyptian government. And this precipitated a series of events that ended up with the United States basically owning the Middle East as the great power security guarantor. This is sort of grand strategy by accident, and it eventually became what was called the Carter Doctrine, this idea that we're actually willing to use force to protect the free flow of oil and gas there. But this has been a function that the British Empire had played. Saudi Aramco and the Iranian National Oil Company, these are all part of the British imperial project in that region, specifically focused around energy. And I guess that's where I think, the long historical lens really helps us to think about what China's trying to accomplish. Yes, they're extremely dependent on oil and gas flows from the Middle East, and that's why we see a very high concentration of Chinese investments in ports and all the auxiliary infrastructure and capability in that region. But we have this interesting case study of, just how seriously do they take the idea of threats to those flows? The Houthis have been raining terror on commercial shipping in one of the major sea lanes in that region. It's not the main choke point for oil and gas, for what it's worth. That would be Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. And China's seen fit to stand by and watch. And maybe that's a question of just sort of a relative prioritization of watching the United States essentially fail to maintain the openness of the system, and that benefits them more than trying to support it and being sort of in league with the hegemonic power. But I suspect it's also that they have no direct intention of providing that public good for others. Now, I'm not sure that the United States did either in 1956, so this is maybe a cautionary tale, and why I won't rule out, of course, a much more ambitious appetite for foreign adventure on the part of China. But I don't see it. And I'll say as a last note on this Middle East point, one thing that analytically came out of doing this comparison is that's the only region where all three of the great powers are playing. Now, Russia is obviously bogged down in a war in Europe, but as you know, they're not going to give up their foothold in Syria. They're still pushing to get into East Africa, and they still have pretensions of great power sort of role as a balancer in the region. And as much as the United States has sought to pivot to Asia for these 15 years now, at least, since it's been on the record as our goal, the exigencies in the Middle East seem to draw us back in, and that certainly is not a mystery to China. As you well know, in 2001, they were the near-peer competitor that the Bush administration was intent on, and it was a godsend that the United States, that events overtook U.S. strategic sense, and we focused there. To the extent that China and Russia share anything in their grand strategy, it is to bog the United States down in unproductive conflicts in other parts of the world. And so there's a question of just how much they'd be willing to participate in that theater to make that happen. But this may be a subject of an entirely different podcast. I want to turn to Andrew for any further thoughts, and we'll close afterwards.
No, I mean, on the French, too, I mean, it's as you mentioned, it's more of an enabler with these middle powers, holding on to possessions. And if China were to act as a disruptor, I mean, the French, the U.S., they could maybe work together to try to deter China. But I don't think there's a large significance to it. In some ways, we can look at bases as status symbols as well, too, if anything. So there's also that dimension of looking at bases.
This has been really a fascinating discussion, and I think we could go on and on and on and still have a lot to talk about. But for now, I just want to thank you, Andrew and Ashley, for a really stimulating conversation, and I'm looking forward to watching how this plays out. So thank you both very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed here are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie Podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find our episodes on Carnegie's YouTube channel as well. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Hewan Park is our executive producer and audio engineer. I'm Isaac Kardon, senior fellow in the Asia program and the host of this episode of The World Unpacked. Thanks for listening.